Did you know that more than 500,000 drones were registered and more than 13,000 remote pilot certificate applications were submitted within the first month of the FAA Part 107 regulations? The rapid adoption of small UAS by Fortune 500 companies have created new opportunities in aviation, and as the applications for drones expand from real estate to construction and insurance inspections, the need for qualified remote pilots is increasing. The AOPA Drones from the Ground Up seminar will cover the topics a prospective remote pilot needs to know for the FAA Part 107 knowledge test while sharing the journey of a commercial drone mission. Seminar topics include aircraft registration, regulations, pilot certification, safety, airspace, small UAS loading and performance, weather, and emergencies. We welcome you to the seminar and the general aviation community.
Okay, look, the thing is about this drone pilot thing in Part 107 is, as we pointed out a minute ago, a lot of you are Part 61 pilots. That means you're real pilots, general aviation pilots. Those of you who aren't are just getting into this industry, but I'm assuming you're going for your Part 107 or at least interested in learning more about it. Therefore, you will become part of the general aviation community as well. And the challenge that we have is we've got to merge these two communities. And I think as a part of that, the general aviation pilots, which is a great community of people, we're going to need to be a little bit of understanding of the new people who are coming in and kind of help them get on the right track and do the right things. And we're going to learn about those things throughout the day. So why we're here to talk UAS, SUAS, Small Unmanned Aircraft Systems, which is FAA speak for drones. And we're going to use the terms SUAS, UAS, UAV, which stands for Unmanned Aerial Vehicle, okay, kind of interchangeably throughout the day in addition to drones. We're going to discuss what you need to fly safely and peacefully coexist in the National Airspace System, or the NAS, with real manned aircraft, whether it's general aviation or commercial aircraft. We'll talk about the NAS in detail later on, and really you're entering a new frontier. You're trailblazers here. This is really not that old. The Part 107 thing was just announced last August. And I'm sorry, do we have anybody in here with a Part 107 license yet? Okay, one gentleman in the back. So we got two licensed people in the back and myself. And so there aren't that many of us yet, but there are a lot coming online. And I hope that you guys will be some of the next. It's really not that different from manned flying. The similar rules, as I said. You're going to have a leg up by earning your manned certificate, because if you do decide to go get your actual Part 61 pilot's license, you will know probably 80% or better of the normal ground school things. So you could probably blow through the ground school and move right to real flight training if you wanted to. So we're going to cover today, we're going to talk about how do you prepare for a real-world flight. We'll talk about some good operational practices. We'll talk about some various scenarios. We'll set up some things and ask for discussion. We'll also talk about where you can and cannot fly in terms of airspace. We'll talk about this thing called airspace in detail. So what is this small unmanned aircraft system? Well, small, yes, less than 55 pounds. Unmanned, yeah. Aircraft, yeah. System, okay, so there's more to it than just the drone. Whether it's a fixed wing drone or a quadcopter or a hex or an octo or whatever it is. You've got the control link, the control station, the uplink. In most cases, you probably have a downlink of some sort so you can see a video feed of what you're actually capturing in the air. So it is, in fact, a fairly sophisticated system. The one thing to not lose sight of is think about this 55-pound thing. Well, it sounds relatively small, but think about it like this. If you're driving down the freeway at 75 miles an hour and one of these big bags of dog food that weighs 50 pounds falls off the back of a pickup truck and hits your car, it's not going to be pretty. And that's what would happen if one of these falls out of the air. In fact, it could be worse because you've literally got a flying lawnmower up there. So just some things to think about, and that's why the FAA has really put together this set of rules and regulations for us to adhere to as Part 107 pilots. So speaking of Part 107, do you have to be a Part 107 pilot to fly drones? No, the answer is no, not unless you're flying commercially. And commercially means you're getting paid for flying drones. If you're just flying as a hobbyist, there's this thing called Part 101, which covers the regulations. It's just a handful of regulations for hobbyists. And so it's not much to worry about. But I suspect that most of you are here for more than just hobbyists, right? At least I would hope so. So let's do a little pop quiz. Quick question to just kind of set up the playing field. Question 1, is it legal to fly a small unmanned aerial system at night under Part 107? How many say no? Anybody say yes? We got one yes over here. It's only legal to fly if you have a waiver from the FAA to fly, which I happen to have. But you have to petition the FAA for a grant of waiver to the Part 107 regulation that says you can't fly at night. In fact, it's a little bit weird because Part 107 does allow flight at what they call civil twilight, which is the 30-minute period after sunset and before sunrise. Okay, so you've got a 30-minute period in there where you can fly under Part 107. The twist is you have to put some kind of illumination on your aircraft that allows it to be seen for 3 miles. Got it? So the anti-collision light is required if you're flying under normal Part 107 during civil twilight. If you're flying at real nighttime, then you need a waiver like I have. And you also have to use, of course, the illumination or the anti-collision lights that can be seen for 3 miles. I'm sorry? No navigation lights are required by the Part 107. Okay, question 2. To be certified as a remote pilot, you have to pass a check ride with an examiner who watches you fly a drone. Yes or no? How many say yes? Good. Well, you guys are right. It's actually no. You don't have to pass a check ride. So it's pretty straightforward. You get the knowledge test right, and then you go fly. Hopefully, you get some stick time before you go out and fly for real, right? Question 3. The acronym TFR stands for Totally Frangible Rotors, Tetrahedral Fuselage Reticulation, or Temporary Flight Restriction. What is it, number 1, number 2, or number 3? 3. Yeah, of course, it's temporary flight restriction. Are these other 2 even a thing? I don't think so. And we'll talk more about TFRs later. Okay, some primary considerations to just kind of get started. These are the big ticket items with Part 107. You need to think about it like a production or a script. You have to plan your flight ahead of time, just like you would normally put a flight plan together if you were a Part 61 pilot. Your procedures for all team members, not just you as the pilot, because my hope would be you've got a team of people going out there if you're shooting commercially. You have you, the pilot. My hope would be you also have a Part 107, my hope would be that you also have a visual observer, which is not necessarily required by Part 107, But the purpose of the visual observer is to keep eyes on the aircraft at all times. Meaning that if I'm the pilot and I'm looking at my view through the onboard camera, I still need somebody who can look at the aircraft in the sky and make sure that it's stable and that there's no manned aircraft coming into the area. Because the FAA regulation says that you have to have the aircraft in sight by the naked eye at all times. Okay, so you should also have some contingency plans. And that means, look, what happens if stuff goes wrong, right? You have maybe you have a power failure, or you have a prop problem, or a motor issue, or something like that. So you need to have some contingency plans. So everybody should know what's happening, and if you're working with a crew, communication is key. And set up that communication before you fly. Don't go out and fly with the crew and just figure that everybody knows what's going on, because ultimately you, as the pilot in command, or PIC, are the person who's responsible for the safety and success of that flight. So what we're going to talk about is these 7 things. We'll go through those throughout the morning. Regulations, airspace, weather, loading and performance, pilot proficiency, state of mind. That sounds a little mushy, right? But it really is a thing, especially in manned aviation, and it translates very well to unmanned as well. And then finally, safety, which is really key. So let's talk about regulations. The thing about regulations, one of the first things to consider is the location of the flight, as I said, and we'll talk about airspace as we go through, but the important thing is, are you flying in airspace where manned aircraft might fly? Airspace around airports is obviously space like that, and it's set up in different classes A, B, C, D, E, and G, and we'll talk more about that later in terms of what all those letters mean, because each one is a little bit different. So what are you shooting? Let's talk about locations. Look at this image and tell me what what potential issues do you see shooting at this location? Got people on the beach, right? Lifeguard stations, something to look out for. Don't fly into it, right? So I think the biggest issue here is the people on the beach. And FAA Part 107 says no operation directly over people. So you can't fly directly over my head. You can fly offset and you're okay. And it's up to the pilot in command to establish what that distance, what that safe distance is. But you can't fly directly over my head legally. And the reason is, if that thing falls out of the sky, we've got a problem. The other issue you see here potentially is privacy. Honestly, if I'm out there on the beach with my girlfriend, I don't want anybody coming in with a drone with a camera, because they're probably going to take pictures and send them to my wife. Okay? So privacy is an issue. So let's look at this one. What do you see here as far as potential issues? You got a field, in case you can't see it, you've got a field out there with high tension power lines running through it. Are the power lines a potential issue? Of course, yeah. If you've got to fly this whole field, and maybe you're shooting agriculture, precision agriculture for a farmer, and you've got to fly this whole field, you've got to watch out for those power lines. You've got to fly above them. And you've also got a potential visual line of sight issue, because there's another FAA regulation that says you can't fly beyond visual line of sight, or BV loss. So there's this notion of visual line of sight, which you have to maintain with your aircraft at all times, and then you'll also hear BV loss, which is beyond visual line of sight. So a couple of issues there. What do you see here? You've got a hazy field. Visibility, thank you, sir. And you're not even a pilot, right? No, yeah, that's what I should have got from one of my pilots. Visibility is a key issue here. You're flying under what's called VFR rules with the Part 107 regulation. And basically what that means is you've got to have a minimum of 3 miles visibility. In addition to that, you can't fly less than 500 feet below a cloud, and you can't fly less than 2,000 feet horizontally from a cloud. And the reason for that is if a manned aircraft is coming through one of those clouds, we don't want it to hit your aircraft. It wouldn't be a good day for you or the pilot in the manned aircraft. Okay, let's talk a little bit about airspace. So I promised you this discussion about airspace. So what do we have here? We have Class A. I'm going to give you a little memory guide, okay? Class A, is this thing working? Yeah, you can't really see it. Okay, that didn't work. Anyway, you can see where it is. Class A, I call that above all else. It's from 18,000 feet and up. You don't have to worry about that because you're not going to be flying there, right? Your limit is 400 feet unless you've got an FAA waiver to fly higher, or if you're flying over a tall structure, and we'll talk about that later. So you got Class A, you've got Class B. B is for busy. So the airspace around busy airports like Class B, a good example would be LAX. Looks like an inverted wedding cake, right? At the ground, you've got what would be the top layer of an upside down wedding cake. And then as it goes up, you have the bottom shelf of the next layer, and so on. And these airspaces in Class B normally have about 3 or 4 different layers that go up like that. Then you have Class C, which is congested. So Class C airspace is Burbank, okay? It's an active airport, not nearly as busy as LAX. If you look at it on the sectional, you'll find that it's got 2 layers. One is, again, the basic drum at the bottom, and that starts the surface, and it goes up to some height, which is specified on the sectional chart. And then you have the next layer that surrounds that. Then you have Class D. What's an example of Class D airspace? You're in it. Whiteman Airport is Class D airspace, and to me, the memory aid for Class D is dialogue. What does that mean, dialogue? That means it has a control tower. You can talk to somebody or dialogue with somebody at a control tower. So that's basically delineates or sets up the difference between Class D and E airspace, because E airspace often surrounds an untowered airport. Not always. Often D airspace is associated with or acts as an extension to Class D airspace that sets up basically over the runway approach and departure lines. Okay? So these are all restricted airspaces. By FAA regulations under Part 107, you can't fly in any of this airspace unless you have a waiver or an authorization, which I've applied for but have not yet received. And the FAA will tell you that it takes about 90 days, best case, to get that waiver right now. I'm about 5 or 6 weeks into mine. And finally, what does that leave? I'm sorry, sir? So the question was, how far outside any of those rings do you have to be? That's a good question, and the answer is you can fly right on the edge. If I were flying right on the edge of controlled airspace, I would do 2 things. One thing I would look at the terminal chart so that I know where the runway is and what the traffic patterns are. And the second thing that I would do is I would have a handheld aviation radio so that I can listen to the communications between the pilot and the control tower and be aware if there's a plane coming into the space that I'm flying in. So the last one, what does that leave? After A, B, C, and D, and E, and wait a minute, what happened to F? It doesn't exist in the United States, it does exist in other countries. So that takes us to G, which is good to go. That's where you can fly. So you got to fly outside of any controlled airspace, A through D, or E, excuse me, and then that leaves Class G. The question was, can you fly in E or not? If E is at the surface, you cannot fly in it. If you've got E that starts at 700 feet or higher, obviously you can fly it because the bottom of the airspace starts at 700 feet. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. You can fly in Class E airspace above the surface. In other words, if that airspace starts above the surface, because the E airspace thing is somewhat confusing. As you'll find out, I've got a chart that's going to cover it in detail in a minute, so bear with me and we'll answer your question, okay? For 400 feet AGL is the max, that's correct. Right. The question was, can you fly in Class E airspace? And the answer was, there are different kinds of Class E airspace. Sometimes it starts at the surface. You can't fly in that. But if the Class E airspace base starts at 700 feet, you can fly in that. Right? Because you're not flying above 400 feet anywhere. Make sense? It does not make sense. Well, bear with me again. I've got a chart on Class E airspace coming up, so I hope if we don't answer your question, then we'll address it specifically, okay? So in addition to all these different classes of airspace, we also have some other things that, that will show up on the sectionals. We're not going to cover them in detail here, but I just want you to be aware of them. Things like prohibited airspace, which is in fact prohibited. Okay, it's space that you can't fly in. An example of that would be around a military base. Or what's called a warning area or an alert area. And these are all different classes of airspace that you can't fly in, period. And then there are other classes of airspace that are controlled, things like military practice areas where they're shooting artillery during certain times. And if you want to fly in that space, you contact the controlling authority in the military and you ask them when are the hot times and when are the cold times in that space. Hot being when they're actually practicing with live artillery. You don't want to be flying there, right? So a lot of different considerations with respect to airspace. Let's talk a little bit more about Class G airspace. It's often called just uncontrolled because that's what it is. It's the one piece of airspace that the FAA doesn't have authority over. You'll find it's not directly shown on sectional charts because it's basically everything else that's not controlled. Typically it extends to the surface, although in the situation of Class E may start at the surface, it may start at 700 feet, it may start at 1,200 feet, and these are all AGL, above ground level. Okay, and in some cases, Class E starts at 14,500. So again, Class E is somewhat confusing for new pilots. Right? Am I right? Pilots in the room? Class E airspace is a little bit kind of confusing sometimes. Oh, and by the way, you'll see two different measurements on the sectionals. In terms of the way that airspace levels or altitudes are specified. You're going to see AGL, above ground level, and you're going to see MSL, which stands for mean sea level or above sea level. When would you use one versus the other? Well, what you're going to find is that airport height is measured in AGL or MSL. It's measured in MSL because if it were measured at AGL, it would all be zero. They'd all be at ground level, right? An airport's on the ground. So airports are measured at MSL. Let's see, if you're looking at Class E airspace, all those measurements are specified in AGL, above ground level. And that's because those are airspaces that are close to the ground. So the pilot needs to be concerned about the distance between his or her altitude and the ground that they're flying over, or the obstacles that may be on the ground they're flying over. You get into other spaces, D, C, and B are specified in MSL, mean sea level. Why is that? Because they're flying higher. Their point of reference should be a standard, which is mean sea level. They can't see the ground, and they can't really relate to where they are relative to the ground. They need to be in MSL altitudes so that they're in the right corridor for their flight. Make sense? Yeah, it's confusing too. Okay, again, let's talk a little bit about Class B. This is a picture of Boston Logan Airport, Class B airspace. You can see the blue concentric circles that start in the middle and then they go out and they get bigger. And you go, why do you think that is? Well, at the base, at the center of this thing, you've got this one drum of airspace, which is the surface space, and it goes up to some altitude. Let's see, where does it go here? It goes to 7,000 feet. Do you see? I don't have it. Does anybody have a laser pointer? Mine's not working. All right, forget. Anyway, you can see up here, right there, 70 over FSC, excuse me, SFC. That stands for 7,000 feet. So the ceiling of that airspace is 7,000 feet. The base of that airspace is at the surface. So that's the way you read the sectional, okay? This next shelf, if you will, out here, 70 over 20. So here, the base of the airspace starts at 2,000 feet, and the ceiling is still at 7,000 feet. So you kind of get the idea of how to read the base and the ceiling in Class B airspace. Got that? Confusing? Maybe. Okay, but wait, there's more. So this would be Burbank, okay? In this case, it's not, it's, what is this? Oh, thank you. Don has produced a laser pointer, thank you. What is this? I forget what it is. This is Grand Rapids, but it could be Burbank, and this is a classic example of Class C airspace. Notice that it's surrounded with a different color line, and that delineates it as Class C instead of Class B. Remember, the Class B airspace was surrounded by blue lines? Class C airspace is surrounded by purple lines or magenta lines, properly called magenta. Okay, so you can see here that the Class C airspace starts at surface here and it goes to 4,800 feet. So you always add 2 zeros to the number that you see here. In the outer shelf, it starts at 2,000 feet and it goes to 4,800 feet. So there's your Class C airspace around Grand Rapids. It'll be similar around Burbank Airport, although I'll show you a picture a little bit later on of a local sectional, and you'll see that this airspace around Los Angeles is a little bit more complex. Class D, again, you're sitting in Class D airspace. It's very straightforward. You have here yet another type of line delineating the space on the sectional. What do you have here? A dashed blue line. So when you see a dashed blue line, you know that that's Class D airspace, right? D for dialogue. That means it has a control tower. You can talk to the control tower, but it's probably not very busy, like we're sitting in it here at Whiteman Airport. Another example of Class D is Van Nuys Airport, which is nearby. And finally, we have Class E. Now, this is where it gets confusing, and this is where I hope, sir, we're going to answer your question. Class E airspace comes in a lot of different flavors. It always shows up as a dashed magenta line when it sits at the surface. And in this case, the Class D airspace is surrounding an untowered airport. How can I tell that it's untowered? How do I know that this Class E airspace that we're looking at on this chart is untowered? So look at this. you see this little picture of the runways right here? They're showing, this is actually a lot of information in here because it shows you the direction of the two runways. So from this you can see how many runways and how they're configured. But the other thing you can see is the color. Did you notice how the color of the runway circle changed from Class E to Class D? You see that Class D shows, and actually B, C, and D will show the little circle where the runways are in blue. And that's why you know it's a towered airport. It's got a control tower, okay? This Class E space that we're looking at here doesn't have a tower. It's untowered. So that's the difference there. The other thing is, right here you've got Class E airspace that starts at the surface. Is there anything inside those dashed magenta lines that tells you that Class E airspace inside those dashed magenta lines starts at the surface? No, there's nothing, because you're supposed to know that. That's something that you're supposed to know. As a pilot, when you look at this sectional and you see dashed magenta lines, you know that that's Class E at the surface. Okay? On the other hand, we have in the shaded magenta line, this is Class E that starts at 700 feet. Now this is getting confusing, right? So I told you Class E airspace is a little difficult to understand, but again, you don't see the 700 anywhere on the chart. You're supposed to know that when you see a shaded magenta line around an airport or around any type of space, in this case, you could see Class E airspace delineated like this around a spot in the middle of the desert. Maybe it's Area 51 around Las Vegas or something like that, right? But you have to know this as a pilot, that this space starts at 700 feet. Did that answer your question, sir, about Class E airspace? I guess. Okay, we're getting there. Okay, so I wanted to show you now that we've talked about all these different classes of airspace, I wanted to show you what our airspace looks like around Los Angeles. Do you remember I talked about this inverted wedding cake? Years ago, I read an article by a commercial pilot who was talking about the airspace around the Los Angeles area. And basically, he made a statement that stuck with me. And at the time, I wasn't even a pilot myself. He said, the airspace around Los Angeles, most airspace looks like an inverted wedding cake. The airspace around Los Angeles looks like somebody took that inverted wedding cake and dropped it on the ground. And that's what you have here. I mean, check this out. So here is LAX, right? And you see the Class B space is kind of all over the place, right? This is Burbank. So it's not the clean delineation of two magenta circles that you saw around the Grand Rapids Airport, right? This has got two magenta circles, but they're not really circles. They're set up differently. What about Whiteman Airport, where we are? Well, if you look closely, you can see this little line right here. That's a dashed magenta circle. And if you took away the Burbank airspace, let's try this again. If you took away the Burbank airspace, that would be a circle around us here at Whiteman Airport. It's obviously being somewhat obliterated by the Burbank airspace, and that tells you that the Burbank airspace takes precedence over the local airspace here at Whiteman Airport. And another airport you have pictured here, actually, I apologize. When I pointed to this, I was pointing at Van Nuys. This is Whiteman up here, and you can see this is the Class D airspace around Whiteman Airport. This, in fact, is Van Nuys. So Burbank, Whiteman, Van Nuys, LAX down here. This is Santa Monica. And then over here, we have three airports in kind of a little triangle configuration. You've got Camarillo, you've got Point Mugu, and you've got Oxnard. These are all Class D. So if you want to shoot here in the Valley, you got a problem. You got to really look at the airspace, and you're going to get a lot of requests from people who want you to fly in airspace you can't fly in without a waiver. So make sure that when you get a request to fly, the first thing you do is you should go look at the sectional. And you can get permission. You have to fill out an online waiver form, and I'll show you the website. I won't go through the entire thing, but I'll just show you so you know what it looks like. This is the FAA website to request a waiver. And basically what you do here is you go down, and they outline the steps here you can see. And then they're going to direct you to an online form that you fill out, where you answer a lot of questions about who you are, what's your pilot certificate number, what's your address, where do you want to fly, and why. And if you fly there, how are you going to mitigate the risk associated with flying in this controlled airspace? And you have to give them a specific write-up on how you plan to mitigate that risk when you make this application. And as I said before, it can take at least 90 days to get an airspace waiver from the FAA. Now they tell me that they're in the process of streamlining this. They've got a system now called LANCE. It stands for Low Altitude Authorization and Notification Capability. Could they have come up with a more complex name? Right. So anyway, this is what I believe is hopefully the online system that will allow one to apply for airspace authorization and receive it almost immediately in the future. It's not there now, and I'm not sure when it's going to be there. But the good news is that they're working on it. No, so the question was, is it a blanket waiver? It's confusing, okay? So there are two types of airspace grants that you can get. You can get an authorization, or you can get a waiver. For everything else, if I want, like I told you, I have a waiver to fly at night, it's called a waiver. But for airspace, you can get authorization to fly at one specific place on one specific date and time only. Or you can apply for a waiver, which is what I have done. I've applied for waivers to fly in Burbank, Whiteman, Van Nuys, Camarillo, and Oxnard airspace, because that's my main market where I want to, at least where I want to start, okay? So I've applied for airspace waivers in those 5 airport areas. And if it comes through, it will grant me permission ongoing to fly with certain restrictions in those 5 different airspaces. Does that make sense? So you got waivers that are continuous, but you've got authorizations, one spot, one time, one date, one time, one only. Yes, sir. What's an example of mitigating risk? So when I submitted my request for waiver for night flight, I have to tell them how I'm going to mitigate the risk associated with flying at night. Do we have any pilots in here who fly at night? You know that the FAA has classic specifications for aeromedical factors associated with phenomena that can occur with the human eye at night, right? In your submission, you have to tell the FAA how you're going to mitigate or train your crew and yourself on what those aeromedical factors are that are associated with nighttime vision. And you have to be able to prove to the FAA that you've done that training by providing a signed certificate that you could produce in the case of a ramp check. Which ramp check means if local authorities came up and said, show me your papers, the papers please, right? You got to be able to produce this thing that says, yes, I conducted this training with my people before we started flying, and they understand the nighttime aeromedical factors associated with vision. Does that answer your question? We'll talk later. Yes, ma'am. Authorizations and waivers you use the same website, and what they'll do is when you get there, they're going to ask you first thing, are you applying for an airspace authorization or a waiver? And then they'll direct you to one of two different forms. Question was, are they both the same amount of time? Well, I got my nighttime waiver in about 5 weeks. I submitted my nighttime waiver at the same time that I submitted my airspace waivers, and I'm still waiting for the airspace waivers. They take a lot longer to get. Because what they have to do is they have to go out and they literally go out and talk to the air traffic control people around each one of these airports and find out how they want them to grant me that permission. It'll vary from airport to airport depending on the unique factors around that airspace. Yes, sir.
Do you have documentation for your authorization only, or do you have to have all the backup documentation with the ramp check that got you the authorization?
The question is, can you have documentation for your authorization only, or do you have to have backup documentation for all of that stuff that got you the authorization? And the answer is, the only thing that you have to be able to produce for the ramp check is the authorization itself. Now, quite frankly, what I carry with me is everything I can, because I don't want any excuses from these guys when they ramp check me. I'm just going to produce 2 3-inch binders full of documentation. Here's all my stuff. What do you need? I don't want there to be any questions. Now, you can carry that electronically, and I know a lot of pilots who do. They carry it in an iPad or something like that, but I choose to carry it in a hard copy. That's just a personal preference. I did, however, at one point I went over to the Van Nuys FSDO, the Field Service District Office, and I asked one of the agents there, I said, if I get ramp checked, do you have a preference as to what I produce in terms of documentation? Should it be hard copy or is soft copy acceptable? And he said, soft copy is acceptable, but I would prefer hard copy. So that's why I carry hard copy. But again, that's a personal choice. Okay, we were going to talk about TFRs, temporary flight restrictions. With a handful of exceptions, TFRs are uncharted. And I meant to point something out here. I'm going to go back to this slide because I want to point something out to you here. Speaking of TFRs, remember this airspace slide for Los Angeles? You see this red circle down here? Does anybody know what that is? Disneyland. Thank you. Disneyland and Disney World have permanent TFRs around their airspace. Now for Disney, that's turned out to be a blessing and a curse. Up until Part 107 and up until actually 333, which we'll talk about later, and this whole drone thing, right? Disney was one of the few companies in the country that was able to get this permanent flight restriction for the airspace over their theme parks. It was a blessing for them until they decided that they wanted to start flying drones as part of some of their shows, right? Then they had to apply for the waivers, just like you and I do. And in addition to that, they had to get a waiver to fly in their own TFR. So anyway, I digress. I apologize. Let's talk, okay, TFRs. So the classic example of a TFR is for the POTUS, the President of the US. If the POTUS comes in to LAX, what happens is the FAA sets up a temporary flight restriction for a 30 nautical mile radius around LAX. And guess what? That extends to here. It actually extends well beyond here. If you look at a 30-mile radius around LAX, what happens is you can't do a lot of flying around here when the POTUS is in town. So that's just one example of a temporary flight restriction. Other things are wildfires, and that's why they're called temporary. They get set up during, temporary events like wildfires, sporting events, things like that. I talked earlier about restricted areas, things like secret government facilities, or Camp David in Maryland is a restricted area. Another example of a restricted area is the immediate area surrounding Washington, D.C. I apologize, I said restricted, I meant to say prohibited. Those are prohibited, those are areas that you just can't fly in, period. Restricted areas, again, examples are things that go hot and cold like military training sites. And then, of course, large sporting events. What happens normally is they set up a 3-mile radius around the stadium 1 hour before to 1 hour after the event. And this gets down to, hey, you can't fly over people. And especially flying over large crowds of people is a huge no-no. I talked also about the DC area. There are two areas there. There's an inner zone and an outer zone. The inner area is prohibited. The outer area, which you'll see specified on the sectional chart, it's just there as an area that is restricted, but it has no more restrictions than the controlled airspace around and outside of that prohibited radius. NOTAMs, notice to airmen. How do I find out about them? Does anybody have this app before you fly? I lost my cursor, hang on. So this app, spinning wheel, love it. This app is actually, you can get it on your iPhone or your Android device. It's an FAA app that was written by the FAA, and it was written really targeted to hobbyists so that they would have an app and say, if I'm standing here, can I fly here? And if you brought that app up on your phone now, you'd find that you'd get a big red X and it'd say prohibited because you're standing in the middle of Class D airspace at Whiteman Airport.